It's incredible when you really think about it, how our ears can pick up like the tiniest whisper, even when there's so much noise around, or how we use words, to communicate these complex ideas and feelings. It's all rooted in some pretty amazing biology, right? And that's actually what we're diving deep into today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be taking a close look at what the scientific literature, or particularly this chapter on hearing and language,
Yeah.
tells us about these senses, these fundamental senses.
So we've been, digging into this chapter, and we're going to try to break it down for you so you can really understand the mechanics behind hearing and speaking, and hopefully, maybe even spark some of those aha moments for you along the way.
Exactly. It's all about giving you a much deeper appreciation for these, seemingly simple actions that are actually incredibly intricate.
So, why don't we start with hearing? It all begins with sound waves, right? These kind of vibrations in the air that carry information about everything around us, and they vary in frequency, which we perceive as pitch, and intensity, which is, loudness. And our auditory system is remarkably good at picking up and interpreting all of that.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. The journey starts in the outer ear, that part we can all see, which acts like a funnel, basically, gathering those sound waves and directing them down the ear canal toward the eardrum.
Okay, so the sound waves hit the eardrum, and then what?
Well, the eardrum starts vibrating, and these vibrations get amplified by a chain of three tiny bones in the middle ear: the malleus, the incusus, and the stapes. Think of them like a little amplification system, boosting the signal before it reaches the inner ear.
Ah, so it's not just a straight shot to the brain. There's this whole intricate process going on.
Exactly. And in the inner ear is where things get really interesting. The vibrations enter the cochlea, this fluid-filled spiral structure. And inside the cochlea is the basilar membrane, which is lined with these incredibly sensitive hair cells. It's these hair cells that convert those mechanical vibrations into electrical signals, the kind the brain can understand.
Oh, so it's like a translation process happening right there in the inner ear.
Right, and get this, different frequencies will vibrate different parts of the basilar membrane. Helmholtz, back in the 19th century, came up with this idea called place theory, where he compared the basilar membrane to, like, piano strings. So each part of the membrane is tuned to a different frequency.
So like high notes would resonate at the base of the membrane and lower notes at the apex, right?
Exactly. And the hair cells in that specific area fire more rapidly, sending a stronger signal to the brain, which is how the brain determines the pitch of the sound. This idea, this place code, is considered one of the primary mechanisms for how we analyze sound frequencies.
It's amazing how our brains can discern all these subtle differences in frequency. But I was reading that this place theory might not be the whole story, especially for lower frequencies.
You're right. The chapter also dives into the volley principle, which comes into play for those lower pitched sounds. Instead of relying solely on the location of vibration, groups of neurons will fire in synchronized bursts, almost like volleys, at the same rate as the sound wave's frequency.
So it's kind of like a team effort with different neurons working together to represent those lower frequencies.
Precisely. It's like a group of singers, each taking a turn to hold a note, and together they create the overall pitch. While the book mentions that how exactly volleys work in processing mid-range frequencies is still being studied, what we know is that these two mechanisms, the place code and the volley principle, work together to give us this incredibly nuanced ability to decode all the complex sounds around us.
It's mind-blowing that this is all happening constantly, automatically, without us even having to think about it. But it's not just passively receiving sound, right? Our brains also actively influence what we hear, like when you're trying to follow a conversation in a crowded room.
Exactly. That's selective auditory attention. This chapter really delves into how the brain can adjust the sensitivity of those hair cells, amplifying the sounds we want to focus on while turning down the volume on others. And this leads to different levels of activity in the auditory cortex, which allows us to filter out all that background noise and zero in on what matters.
It's like our brain has its own built-in noise-canceling headphones.
In a way, yeah. And then there's another critical ability, figuring out where a sound is coming from, which is obviously super important for, navigating our surroundings and knowing what's happening around us.
Right, like if we hear a car horn, we need to know which direction to look.
Absolutely. So our brain has specialized neural circuits that process these tiny differences in the intensity, the timing, and even the phase of a sound as it reaches each ear. These are called binaural cues. And these subtle discrepancies are all the brain needs to pinpoint where sound is coming from and even how far away it is.
It's amazing how our brains can extract so much information from something as seemingly simple as sound waves hitting our ears. And it makes me think about how some animals and even some people can use sound to see, basically, using echolocation.
The chapter touches on that, yeah. Echolocation can be passive, where you're just listening to how ambient sounds bounce off objects, or active, where you make a sound, like a click, and use the echoes to map your surroundings. It's incredible how adept some humans can become with active echolocation.
Yeah, I mean, the example of Daniel Kish, who's been blind since he was a baby and uses tongue clicks to navigate the world, it's incredible. He can walk through traffic, hike in the woods, even identify different types of trees just by how sound reflects off them. It really shows the amazing plasticity of the brain and how much information we can gather from sound.
It's a testament to how adaptable our sensory systems are.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the other big topic of this chapter, language. And here, research has really zeroed in on two crucial brain regions, Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
Right, Broca's area, if I remember correctly, is all about speech production.
You got it. It's located in the left frontal lobe, and it's heavily involved in the physical act of speaking, planning, and coordinating those muscle movements. And it also plays a role in grammar. Now, back in the 1860s, Paul Broca had this patient who, after a stroke, could barely speak. And when Broca examined his brain after he passed, he found damage to this specific area, which we now call Broca's area.
So damage to Broca's area causes Broca's aphasia, right, which affects a person's ability to actually speak.
Exactly. People with Broca's aphasia will have trouble forming words. Their speech is slow and effortful, and they often struggle to find the right words. And their sentences might lack those grammatical connectors, like articles and prepositions, making it sound a bit like a telegram.
Like saying dog walk park instead of I'm going to walk the dog in the park.
Precisely. Now, in contrast to Broca's area, there's Wernicke's area, which is located in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus. This area is all about language comprehension.
So making sense of the words we hear and read.
Exactly. Carl Wernicke, building on Broca's work, identified this area as essential for understanding language. When there's damage to Wernicke's area, you get Wernicke's aphasia, which presents quite differently. People with Wernicke's aphasia can speak fluently, and their sentences are grammatically correct, but the words they use often don't make sense.
Like they might string together a bunch of words that sound grammatically correct, but the meaning is all jumbled up.
Yeah, exactly. They might also have difficulty understanding what others are saying to them. It's like the words are there, but the meaning is lost in translation.
So we have these two key areas, one for speaking and one for understanding. There's a model, I think, that explains how information flows between them, right?
Yes, the Wernicke-Geschwind model. It proposes this pathway for language processing. So let's say you hear someone say a word. The sound first goes to the auditory cortex and then to Wernicke's area to be decoded. If you need to respond verbally, that information travels through a bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus to Broca's area, which formulates the speech plan and sends the instructions to the motor cortex to actually produce the words. For reading, the visual information from the words on the page goes to the visual cortex, then to the angular gyrus, and finally to Wernicke's area for comprehension.
That's helpful for visualizing how it all works, but the chapter mentions that it's not quite as simple as that, right? Like language is way too complex to be just limited to those two areas.
Definitely. While the Wernicke-Geschwind model was, pretty groundbreaking for its time, modern neuroscience tells us that language is much more spread out across the brain, involving a whole network of regions. It's much more dynamic and interactive than a single pathway can capture.
And it's not all about the left hemisphere either, is it? I seem to recall that the right hemisphere also plays a role, especially when it comes to the emotional aspects of language.
Right. The chapter points out that while the left hemisphere is usually dominant for, the core linguistic functions, the right hemisphere is crucial for understanding things like humor, sarcasm, the emotional tone in someone's voice. It adds that extra layer of nuance and emotional context to our communication.
It's like the right hemisphere helps us read between the lines, so to speak. And, when you think about how quickly kids pick up language, it makes you wonder if there's something innate about it, like some biological programming for language.
The chapter delves into this idea of an inherent predisposition for language. Now, while there's debate about whether there's a specific language acquisition device in the brain, there's definitely strong evidence for a biological readiness for language. For example, both hearing babies and deaf babies born to signing parents go through a kind of babbling phase. The hearing babies babble with their voices, and the deaf babies babble with their hands, making these rhythmic, repetitive motions.
So it's like they're practicing the building blocks of language, whether it's spoken or signed.
Exactly. And the book even mentions how this manual babbling in deaf babies goes through stages that are very similar to the stages of spoken language development in hearing babies. It really suggests there's this innate drive to experiment with the components of language, regardless of the form it takes.
That's fascinating. And there's also a connection between rhythm and language, right?
Yes. The chapter highlights research showing that we're hardwired to be sensitive to the rhythmic patterns of language. And this sensitivity develops early on. In fact, there's evidence that difficulties with rhythm in childhood can be linked to problems with reading later in life.
That's a surprising connection. And I remember reading about how, even in adults, certain language centers in the brain can become active in unexpected situations, like during musical improvisation.
Exactly. Research has shown that when musicians are jamming together, improvising, there's activation in brain areas that are typically associated with language processing, suggesting that there's a kind of musical conversation going on, tapping into those same neural resources for communication and creative expression. And even without actively trying, adults can pick up elements of new languages just by being exposed to them.
So, if we're hardwired for language, where did this ability come from? Does the chapter offer any insight into the evolutionary origins of language by looking at how other animals communicate?
The chapter explores this very question, and it points to primate communication as a potential window into our own linguistic past. Some researchers propose that the gestures used by primates, especially hand and face gestures, could be more closely related to human language than their vocalizations. The idea is that our ancestors might have relied on gestures for communication initially, and then the neural pathways for language built upon that foundation.
It's interesting to think of gestures as a possible precursor to spoken language.
Right. And there's actually evidence to support this. Studies have shown that chimpanzees use a surprisingly wide range of hand gestures, and a lot of them are similar to gestures we use. The chapter also highlights research showing that the ability to imitate gestures is really important for language development in children.
The chapter also mentions mirror neurons, those special brain cells that fire both when we do something and when we watch someone else do the same thing. Could they play a role in language development?
Exactly. Mirror neurons are thought to be really important for imitative learning, which is obviously crucial for acquiring language. They could provide the neural mechanism that allows us to understand and replicate gestures, and eventually the sounds associated with language.
So it's not just our brains, our genes are involved too, right? The chapter talks about the FOXP2 gene, I think.
Right. The FOXP2 gene is one example of a gene involved in language functions. And what's really interesting is that a variant of this gene has also been found in Neanderthals, suggesting that the capacity for language has a long evolutionary history, going back even further than our own species.
And finally, the chapter touches on dialects, the regional variations in language. Are those just learned differences, or is there something more to them, biologically speaking?
While dialects are primarily shaped by cultural and social influences, the chapter suggests that they can also provide us with really interesting clues about historical population movements. The way language varies from region to region can actually reflect the migration patterns and interactions of different groups throughout history. It's like language can hold a record of our past.
That's really cool. Wow, this deep dive into the biology of hearing and language has been fascinating. It really makes you appreciate the complexity of these senses that we often take for granted.
Absolutely. We've uncovered all these intricate mechanisms, from how we capture and decode sound waves, to the crucial role of the basilar membrane, to the specialized brain regions that process auditory information. And for language, we've explored Broca's and Wernicke's areas, the fact that language is distributed across the brain, and the compelling evidence for our biological predisposition to learn and use language.
It's amazing to think about how all these different components, from our ears to our brains to our genes, work together to allow us to experience the world through sound and to communicate with each other through language. So, to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as you go about your day. Given all this intricate biological machinery that allows us to perceive sound and to speak and understand language, what does it tell us about what it means to be human? How does our capacity for communication through sound and language connect us to each other and to the world around us? What new questions have emerged for you after this exploration?
It really is something to think about.
It is.
It really is.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.